Hello, this is John Gulick with Storysmithing, and I'm really excited for the episode today. I've had a couple of sort of half-formed ideas about where I think this is going to head under the general theme, and I think there's going to be a lot of fun things to discover and to lay out in some more detail. So what I'd like to focus on today is to revisit that Quest and Cook video game idea and in particular focus on what amounted to a sentence or two from our previous two episodes. Specifically, we discussed that the player would be saddled with some characters that would make up the party, and it would be those characters that the player would be feeding. We sort of left it at that. I think the knight and an elf were two characters that we created for the purposes of our prior brainstorming, but nothing beyond that. So, what I'd like to do today is focus on that aspect of the game and build out a set of really interesting, really diverse characters that introduce a lot of different problems and different variables for the player to balance. And in doing so, I think that's going to kind of close the loop on the last of our gameplay mechanics slash video game loops. And sort of the only final piece will be to build the actual stories that would make up that dinner phase. So lightning round here, just super quick recap of the game if you're coming into it fresh here. We're building a game called Quest and Cook. More specifically, I guess we're blueprinting it, coming up with how it would work. So Quest and Cook is an open world game. You play as a cook, and you're coupled with a handful of adventurers. And your goal is to feed them and equip them prime them for success. You're doing that by collecting resources from various environments, so scavenging food, enlisting the help of hunters to acquire meat for your party, that sort of thing. So that is round one of the game, as you are collecting food. Round two, you then use that food and prepare a meal, dinner specifically for your party. And when they return from their day of adventuring, you have this meal ready for them. Now, there's a lot of gameplay mechanics going on behind the scenes. Depending what meal you make is going to influence how well the characters like the meal, how well they will perform on the next day's quest, how much or how much their stats will increase or decrease in a persistent manner. So we've got a couple things under the hood that are connected to this meal, a couple things prefacing the meal that the player has to consider and has to actually do. That would be the scavenging and determining which meal to make, which is going to be most optimal, that sort of thing. And then we have a few things that I would say are more unique, such as the specific character preferences related to things like specific items, specific meals. These would be a little bit divorced from the standard meal, post-meal influences. So there may, for example, be a specific item that the knight really enjoys. Maybe it's a certain type of whetstone for, to sharpen a weapon. If the player can acquire that through trade, through whatever, and get that to the knight, that's going to be a great boost to the knight's morale. That hints at the other big element of our game, which is an economic system. So in addition to making meals, the player is managing the party's resources, gold and items. And they're strategically leveraging what they have versus what they want in various environments. So in our last episode, spoiler alert, we created 7 different environments that the game can parade the party through. Each environment has different strengths, different weaknesses, and different preferences. And it's the player's goal to balance those 3 against what the party needs and what the party has to kind of create the optimal meal and long-term benefit for the group. So lots of variables to play with. Couple gameplay mechanics that I haven't mentioned, but we'll just kind of proceed forward and see if they filter in a meaningful way later in this episode. And like I said, our goal today, I really want to play with the characters and to identify a host of characters that would influence those other game mechanics I just mentioned in a really interesting way. And in doing so, I think there's probably going to be some other game mechanics that we unearth or that we refine in more detail that are already kind of on our list. But let's go ahead and get started. So I think a good place to start is what we already have. So we discussed the knight and the elf. Those would be two characters that could be on the party at the start. I'm considering whether it's a good idea to start by saying, excuse me, that this is the specific number of characters we'd like in the player's party. I have a hunch though that as we develop this band of characters, we're going to have a feeling of that optimal stopping point. So I think let's just go ahead and add some more detail to these characters and then start building out more from there. So what variations do we want each player to have? An obvious one is food preferences. So we want different preferences for each character so that when the player has to make a meal, they need to balance different preferences. For example, our knight, I think we had previously said, enjoys meat-heavy meals and appreciates quantity. So those would be two markers of the knight's food preference. The elf would enjoy lighter meals and specifically things like greens. Greens, bread. We could add things like wine, maybe. Wine would be. Let's differentiate food preferences from drink. I think that'll be helpful. So a knight, I'll add a drink heading here, would enjoy. What do we want a knight to enjoy? As I said in the first two episodes where we've been brainstorming this game, I think since our player base is primarily maybe a young adult teenage type player, I'm not afraid to lean into more stereotypes because that's what our audience is expecting and it's what they would probably enjoy most in the game. So that being said, the knight I think would enjoy drinking things like ale would be their primary drink of choice or what would make them happiest. I have a feeling as we go here that we're going to find other variables we want to introduce for the characters and that we're going to be backfilling a lot as we go. So another character or race, we'll just keep going with the Lord of the Rings theme here, would be a dwarf. So let me go ahead and add that here. What would a dwarf like to eat? Like we did with the environments, we want to keep every character fresh here. So that means we don't want to keep overlapping different food preferences and drink preferences. We want to keep it distinct because that's going to introduce more challenges for the player and other opportunities as well. That other opportunities is hinting at another gameplay mechanic that I kind of have a half-formed idea of, that different characters would influence the success rate of a quest in different ways, or that we may make the sort of the quest success formula more precise in the episode today. To pare that down a little bit, I think it'll be helpful or would be fun to give each character some stats that filter into the success of the quest, and that to give different quests different sort of stat requirements or that sort of thing, so that so that each character can contribute to the success of the quest in a direct way, rather than simply saying the morale of the character is all that counts. I think giving the character a more specific way to help the quest is good. That being said, I think it's still easier for us to start with kind of their food and drink preferences and try to build that diverse base. So let's keep going there. For a dwarf, I think for a drink we can give the dwarves something a little bit stronger. So knights enjoy ale, elves enjoy wine slash water, but I think let's leave it at wine for them. We've got an alcoholic team so far. Dwarves can enjoy something a little bit harder, so let's say spirits, which would be our liquor, brandy sort of drink. So 3 separate drinks. Food, let's give them a little bit something different. So what would a dwarf enjoy? If we look up at our environment, the dwarves are living in caves, and their primary cuisine there is mushrooms and root vegetables. So I think for the dwarves especially, since they are based in that cave environment, let's give them that preference. So they're going to enjoy mushrooms and sort of root vegetables. But I want to color it a little bit by giving them like a specific meat preference. Think about dwarves in movies, in books. They are a very hardy people, and I do want that to filter into this game a little bit. So what kind of an animal would the dwarves really enjoy? It doesn't make sense really that they would have a historical connection to it through their cave. Like there's no deer wandering into these caves. These underground caves, these are not sort of, caves just dug into a mountainside. These are large underground caverns. For a second there, I was tempted to do something like bear. Bear meat would be, obviously bears would probably be in caves more than something like a deer. But what I think I want to do is find a meat that the dwarves would commonly be traded or given, and then that would logically kind of evolve as their meat of choice. Or we could actually flip that on its head and say that there's a specific meat they very rarely get because it's from a different environment, and that's what they really, really enjoy. I think we can do both actually. So let's say that there's this a base meat that they prefer, and then something rare or from farther away that is exceptional for the dwarves. So a common meat would be, since the cave is near the forest, something like deer. We could say bison. So I'll say deer and bison are good. So those are the good meats. And then what would be really excellent? What would be the least common sort of food for the dwarves to encounter? Birds would be very rare. If we really reflect the cave, then something of the air would be sort of thematically the most different for them. Or we could say something from the mountain. Again, I think this is like that commercial where I think it's a Bush Beans commercial where they say, why not X and then why not Y, and the little girl holds the can of beans up and says, why not both? I think I want to do that again here, where let's couple the mountain and the bird cuisine. So the dwarves' that's a fun word. Favorite meat is, and now we just need to invent or determine some kind of bird that is in the mountain environment. So what would that be? I don't think it's that important right now. I don't want necessarily to get hung up in the weeds on this. For the reason that a lot of those minor details are things that I'm going to, I think, determine on my own time, just to cut out a lot of the umming that is sort of necessary in that process. for us, I really want to lay down the groundwork of how these characters work. Generally, what do they like and how do they contribute to the quest success? I think that's the most bang for our buck. So, that being said, the dwarves' favorite meat is going to be a mountain bird. Okay, so that's good. I want to try to lay out as many characters as possible and not get hung up for 5 or 10 minutes on each one, ideally. So we'll see how that pans out. Other characters that we could have on our party. There's so many. I think the ceiling on our discussion today is determining the cutoff limit. And maybe that's probably a part of the conversation of how many characters are selected for the player's party. But let me just list out a couple that I want to explore more. So a healer would be one, or we could say a cleric maybe. A paladin, well, I don't really want a paladin actually. So a cleric, we could say an alchemist. I am reading Aragon right now, which is an excellent book, and I'm very nostalgically going to put dragon in there. We can have a dragon on the party. I see no issues with that. Who doesn't want a dragon on their team? So cleric, alchemist, dragon. What other... I'm thinking, is it helpful to have elf and dwarf be their own category? Here's an idea. Okay, I think our character creation just took on a different flavor. I think I was looking at elves, dwarves, and humans too simplistically. Where to say that all elves will fill the same role in the quest is a really limited perspective. So to say that all elves, we can say all elves generally will like the same meals, the same food, the same drink, but to group them as their own character, I think takes away a lot of the flexibility and the nuance that we want to introduce in this portion of the game. So the thought that I had was, let's identify a couple races, give them a baseline preference, and then let's subdivide different roles being cleric, alchemist, archer, knight, warrior, barbarian, things of that sort. And let's add more texture to the specific roles. So then we could have a human archer. So let's say, just to hopefully add some more concreteness to this, maybe an archer would prefer lighter meals than a knight. So if we have a human archer, that human baseline, I guess we would need to determine that. Let's switch this up. If we had a dwarven archer, dwarves baseline like mushrooms and root vegetables and certain meats, but a dwarven archer would like those things. Would like those things, but would have a really strong affinity for the things that we associate with the archer. So maybe that's greens, salads, maybe stews, whatever. So by creating the pantheon of races, let's say we come up with 3, 4, 5 races, and then 10 to 20 subgroups, we then have 60 to 160 or whatever our character count is. We come up with a huge amount of variations of that, which adds a lot more replayability and a lot more strategy in there. So I like that a lot. So let's go back a second and fill out our human preferences. I'm really inclined to say just balanced for the preferences here. Generally likes everything, but loves nothing. And for our drink, I'm tempted to make the drink water to lean into that sort of everyness. It would be fun to have ale as the human drink, but I think let's just do water. Keep it simple. So humans are our jack of all trades, like everything. Downside of that is that there's no sort of super effective food that is really probably going to inspire them, unless if that comes from their role. So back to that elven or that archer example. If it's a human archer, they generally like everything, but maybe they do really like salads or whatever we constitute the archer role with. Okay, I like that a lot. I think that's gonna, whoops, I think that's gonna give us a lot to focus on today. So humans, elves, and dwarves are three races. Dragon would technically be another race, but that's not going to backfill into the roles. So let's kind of leave that out of our discussion today. Do we want to bring in things like orc? Yeah, of course we do. I just had an immediate thought of the orc preferences, which is mostly the reason for my excitement of it. So an orc would be another race, and at this point we're nearly going down the list of Skyrim options. But an orc choice, if we're thinking of Lord of the Rings and that sort of thing, raw meat is going to be their preference, right? No vegetables essentially, and enjoy raw meat. So already we're seeing conflicting food preferences. So the orc seems to be essentially the opposite of everything else with its preferences because it doesn't like vegetables. So it's the exact opposite of elves and dwarves a little bit. And then it enjoys raw meat. And we can assume so far human, elf, dwarf all like regular cooked meat. I'm going to hop down to dragons for a second, and for those preferences, I'm also going to add raw meat because I think we want some symmetry. We don't want the orc to be the only character that enjoys raw meat. There is going to be a lot more detail added to the dragons later. I think I've had a couple ideas on potential goals, at least, to identify different types of dragons that could fit in. But let's continue with the orc here. So preferences: no vegetables, enjoys raw meat. Drink. What would orcs drink? This is a difficult question, actually. What would an orc drink? I don't want it to be something. Well, it could be something as sort of gross and gristly as like animal blood. I don't think we want to go there. That's a little bit too dark for our audience, for our intended tone for the game. So what do we want to do here? I think for now, let's just say water and let these orcs be on the carnivore diet, not drinking anything that's giving them calories. They're just having meat. They've been studying their carnivore diet statistics. Okay, what other races do we want to include in here? Human, elf, dwarf, orc. What other options would there be? Maybe we should start there and select. So we can differentiate elves more if we want. You know, high elf, dark elf, wood elf, things like that. I don't feel inclined to do that. If we do that, we're gonna get too into the weeds on the race differences that filter down into the role differences, and this is going to become a chess game of overly strategizing. We want the strategy to be accessible but complex, and not to be not to take 20 minutes just to learn the basic rules. We want the rules to be easy to pick up and then difficult to master. So what other options would there be? If I'm thinking of Skyrim, we could invent sort of non-human animalistic races, things like the Khajiit. I don't really want to do that. We could have a few different cultures of humans that do have different preferences. I think we're getting into the same situation as elves, though. So for now, let's leave it at this. We have currently 4 sort of humanoid races plus dragon. 5 could be a good hierarchy. And then if we get a good variety of roles, that's really gonna multiply our character potential. So let's go down to roles and lay some of those out. So we already have cleric, alchemist. Let's backfill knight, archer, barbarian can be one. And let's just start there. That might take us a little bit to get through. So knight, we had determined likes meat, heavy meals, and large quantities. So the most greedy possible character would be, well, I guess we changed the human to not already like meat heavy meals, but an orc knight would be absolutely crazy for meat and would need so much. That character would require so much resources to succeed, but it would need to have a higher potential benefit to the quest. So that's the knight. Archer, let's say leafy greens. Again, this is sort of the quintessential elf. Leafy greens, fruits, vegetables, and bread. Okay, here's a question. What happens if we have an orc archer where they're necessarily at odds with each other? Does that character become like a human in the sense that they prefer everything? Or is it the opposite where they really don't enjoy eating? I think that's an important question because as we build out all of these roles, for example, the barbarian, I think it would be likely that they would also enjoy raw meat. As we build out these roles, we're going to have these conflicts where the race and the role have different different preferences. So what happens when that happens? I think it could even out. Like I was saying with the human preference of just generally liking things. So if we had that orcish archer, they would eat things like leafy greens, fruits, vegetables, and maybe still they would still eat raw meat, but they wouldn't like the raw meat as much, so it would have a dampened effect, and neither would they like leafy greens, fruits, vegetables as much. So I think I like that. Because what that is doing is it's presenting the opportunity for roles to be amplified or for strengths of roles to be amplified and for weaknesses of roles to be dampened. So for example, the orc is pretty much hung out to dry in all environments except prairie and forest where there is fresh meat. In the other places where there's either high concentration of fruits or vegetables or fish, the orc is going to have a terrible time. Is going to be on a fasting diet, essentially, especially if their drink is water. I really like that because the orc is going to be a super specialized character in terms of their food needs. So back to my earlier point, what I like of pairing things like the archer with the orc is that it removes the weaknesses of the orc, but it also takes away some of that advantage of, we could say let's say the orcish knight, so an orc that loves raw meat and heavy meals of meat, would be like 1.5 or 2 times more effective in certain quests than the orcish archer. So to gamify that, let's say the orcish knight's strength capacity, like a baseline game starting strength capacity, is 200, and the dexterity or the constitution or whatever stat we want to label it is something like 50. The orcish archer may only have a strength of 100, so it would be half as strong as the knight variant, but its constitution or its dexterity would be higher. So in other words, we're rebalancing. We're giving the means to rebalance characters and races in different ways to emphasize or dampen weaknesses and strengths. So good that question is answered. We don't necessarily have to worry about conflicting roles and races anymore. So Barbarian is going to enjoy raw meats. This makes sense sort of logically if barbarians are essentially unsophisticated, uncivilized fighters. They're going to be very good at killing things, not very good at sort of the finer points of life, such as cooking and seasonings, fancy meals. They're blood oriented. So barbarians are generally going to enjoy raw meats more. A cleric, this would be a much more sophisticated person who has an eye towards healing. So when I think of healing within the medieval setting, within most medieval games, herbs and things like poultices, potions, maybe not potions, but herbs and kind of natural cures are typically in the forefront, whether they are the solution or they're a component in something like a potion or a spell. So that's leading me to the idea that these clerics would similarly enjoy sort of herbs, vegetables, you know, maybe hearty meals, but they have an eye, or not hearty, but rounded meals. How about that? Rounded meals, and especially enjoy spices / herbs. So I think that's fair. If I'm having another thought here, since our next point is the alchemist. I think it would make a lot of sense for the alchemist to enjoy very rounded meals. They see the benefit of what can come from combining all the necessary ingredients to make a greater whole. It also does kind of make sense for the clerics to enjoy a rounded meal, but I think the alchemist fits that better. So I'm going to move that preference to the alchemist. So this is kind of similar to the human in that they do enjoy everything. But let's say the difference here is that alchemists prefer everything together. So in other words, it's not enough to have 3 distinct meals that collectively incorporate a variety of ingredients. Each meal needs to have many ingredients to please the alchemist. So they enjoy meals with many ingredients. So back to the cleric, I think we leave in that they enjoy spices and herbs, but what is their baseline? We don't have anything that prefers fish over meat yet. We could add that to the sort of archer. I'm not opposed to that. We also don't have that in any of the races. I think later on with the dragon, we'll probably do something like a water dragon, which would be a fish eater. But I think we need another race and probably another role to prefer fish. Okay, so then the question is, do we want elves to prefer fish? I don't think so, because the elves are currently holding sort of the vegetarian role, And I think we certainly want to keep that. We just need to find a different place for the fish. Maybe we can come back to that. Nothing's coming to mind right now outside of the water dragon or, different creatures we could use to fill that. Um, would it make sense for the cleric to enjoy fish? I think we could make an argument for that. It's in line with kind of the light fare that I think naturally fits the more academic, scholarly cleric. This isn't somebody that's going to be stuffing their face with turkey legs and that sort of thing. So yeah, so let's say the clerics do enjoy fish and meals with spices and herbs. So this is sort of the cleric is sort of our offshoot human variant where they also enjoy rounded, not rounded meals, but nearly any ingredient, but they specifically enjoy fish. It is their sort of super effective food that impacts them much more dramatically than anything else. So we also have the alchemist. Let's see what other roles do we want to toss in here. I'm going to move dragon up into our races here, so that's where it should be. All right, knight, archer, barbarian, cleric, alchemist. From a team building composition, what do we have so far? We have a tank in the knight, a ranged unit in the archer, a tank / damage unit in the barbarian, a healer in the cleric. The alchemist could be a healer / magical force. Let's add another magical unit. So let's say a wizard. And let's see if we can do a few more characters while we're in the groove. I'm a little bit leery of lifting like a paladin. I'm not sure why that character in particular is causing some friction for me, but I don't feel a need for it right now. Wizard, let's do assassin. Does that, or rogue? Maybe let's be more kind and say rogue. Bard could be one, so this would be kind of the offshoot of cleric. So another support unit that is able to inspire and motivate the party. So far, this puts us at 3, 6, 8 total characters. I think 10 at least is a decent benchmark to shoot for. Getting closer to 15 or 20 would be really nice, I think. That would add a lot of unique flavors. So what other, I guess let's focus on support for a second. We've got cleric, bard, maybe alchemist. Those are all support units, so that's 3 support units. In terms of tank, we have knight. Maybe we can count barbarian in there, so we have 2 tanks. Can we create a third? This isn't a tank, but I'm thinking of something like a duelist or a swordsman. This wouldn't, we can't do something as specific as like a samurai, but something along that vein. What would be different enough from the knight in the barbarian? Someone that would fight with some grace rather than strength as their primary feature. So essentially, we're talking about dexterity rather than strength to be talking about stats. The rogue would fit this to some degree. That would be a little bit more of the sneaking, maybe archer type character, but also the ability to use knives and sort of fill that balance of distance and melee. I think for now, let's just say swordsman. That doesn't quite feel like the term I'm searching for, but I think for our outlining purposes, it'll certainly work. So that's kind of two, 1.5 knights, three melee specific people. We need some more magic, I think. More magic would be fun. If we assume the cleric is non-magical and they're just doing natural herbs and remedies, then we only have two magical people, alchemist and wizard. The bard, I'm going to move up by the cleric to be in a similar sort of support role. So for our magical, we have wizard and alchemist. What else could we have in there? We could do, trying to think of roles that would likely fill a sort of unique food. So necromancer feels at odds with our theme, with our casual, relaxed theme. But I'm also thinking it would present some unique food opportunities. So obviously necromancers reanimating the dead. They would maybe have a unique taste for spoiled or older food, which would be another variable. If we add on to the food that it does actually spoil or go bad after a time, that's another factor. I think I like. So let's add necromancer in there. And that brought up another thought that I just wanted to mention here again. I've said this in previous episodes, but I'm envisioning two paths for this game, two gameplay paths, difficulties. One being the casual experience. So this would be the equivalent of kind of the Minecraft creative mode. And that difficulty would strip out a lot of the more difficult elements, which I don't necessarily want to sideline us right now and go through all of those. But one of them would be things like food spoiling. I think in the casual mode, food would just persist and would be fine. In the standard or difficult mode, we would give the player the full whammy. So it would be everything we can imagine to make the game as playable and enjoying and exciting as fun without over complicating it. So all that is to say, I think the necromancer will work, and it will be an added difficulty in that standard game mode where food can spoil. In the kind of creative game mode, the necromancer may have to be taken out because the food wouldn't spoil. That's kind of an unimportant point right now, I think. So let's keep rolling with some of these roles. So we've got 5 more roles laid out here. Let's see if we can give them a some preferences. So back up to Bard. This is one of our support characters, a musically inclined person who is going to be able to support the party's morale, motivation, and maybe offer some kind of small benefit in the actual questing. So what would a bard enjoy for food? I think certainly we can say ale. This is, I guess we are sort of leaving out drink preferences in the roles. I think that's something we should probably try to add in, although I'm sensing we're getting back towards overcomplicating things. So do we only want the races to have a preferred drink? I do actually feel like that's what we want to do, and just leave the drinks with the races and let that be the primary determiner of what the character enjoys. So let's leave ale out of the bard and just talk about their food preference. So I think it would make sense that the bard would enjoy tavern food. So things that would be prepared at an inn, because this is primarily where they're going to be earning their living, and it makes sense that what they eat consistently is what they enjoy. If it wasn't, they wouldn't eat it. So things that would be made at an inn would be relatively more complicated meals than the road fare, maybe some of these other roles would be accustomed to. So I'll just add that in. This is going to be rounded but complicated meals. So the bard, I think, is going to be one of our pickiest characters. So I'm going to add that note in here as well. The wizard, hopping down to that one. The wizard, I think, can we do something interesting with the wizard? So what have we done so far with the roles? Food preferences. We have heavy meat meals. We have light vegetable meals. We have raw meat. We have fish and herbs. We have complicated meals. And we have rounded meals. So we've played a little bit with quantity, only on the large end, I guess, with the knight. We have played with some of the contents of the meal, whether that be meat, vegetables, or fish. So a wizard, I could see, does it make sense? Here's what I'm wondering. Does it make sense to say the wizard enjoys light meal, like small meals? Does that present a challenge to the player? Even if it's a different preference from the other characters, I don't see that as another challenge for the player. It's like easing the burden of producing a larger meal, which we don't necessarily want. We want a different challenge. So I think what I'm sensing or wondering here is one of our former gameplay mechanics was that rather than stick with this is going to work. Rather than stick with the predetermined meals, so various recipes the player can either start off with or acquire through the game that, say this is exactly how to make the meal. In our difficult game mode, the player can also experiment. So they can just make a meal without following a recipe. And I think what we want to do for the wizard is rather than giving them a specific fixed preference, we say that they enjoy creative meals that are good. So this is moving the crosshairs totally away from what we have for the other characters onto the creative meal that a player has to imagine themselves, select the quantities themselves, make themselves without the instruction from the recipe. Wizards are going to appreciate the creativity, the knowledge, the forethought, all of those kind of intellectual additives to the meal. It's not even necessarily the meal that the wizard enjoys, but it's the creative process that went into the meal that the wizard likes the most, which is, like I said, is completely different from the other roles. So I think that's really good. And the kind of second order effect of that is that so say you're a player and you get a knight, an archer, a barbarian, and a wizard in your party. First couple rounds, you make easy meals for your first three of those characters. They're all very happy, but as those later rounds come along, the wizard is progressively losing morale and isn't gaining stats like you want the wizard to. So you're in a situation where you need to make a creative meal. You need to look at your pantry, your pool of food, and you need to find a way to combine it in a way that is exciting to the wizard. That is at odds, or could very easily be at odds with presenting a good meal for your other three characters. So in other words, by being essentially forced to make a creative meal every now and then, you're going to have more problems with your other characters because you can't make a meal that is going to please the other ones. So yeah, so that's great. I really like that a lot. Down to the necromancer, we had said enjoy spoiled foods. spoiled or old foods. So I guess like cheese would be a good one for this. Cheese. I don't do. Do we want to do like spoiled meat and stuff in here? Um, I don't know if we need to determine that right now, but just generally older foods are appreciated by the necromancer, and this taps into the same thing as the wizard. Of we could add a mechanic where older foods in the pantry more rapidly decrease the or I should say increase the rate of decomposition for the other foods. So this is like if you have a bag of bad apples and you put some good apples in there, they will spoil faster in that bag than in open air. And like I said, this goes back to the sort of same second order effect of the wizard, where if you have a necromancer on your team and you need to let some of the food spoil, it's going to cause friction with your other characters. Um, so we're introducing more of a challenge there. And what we need to do, and this may be the second half of the brainstorming today, is layouts like what constitutes the stats for these characters that of how they contribute to the quest. In tying this all back together, since the wizard and necromancer lessen or are hindrances in the sort of meal aspect, they need to have a greater strength in the questing aspect. I think we want to balance it like that. So let's carry on with our rogue. So, what would a rogue like? I'm trying to think of other variables we can play with, and this one is actually coming pretty easily to mind, I think. So, when I think of a rogue, I think of sort of a thieving, troublesome person who, like we said earlier, fits that role of archer, knife, assassin, trifecta. Probably to connect this with Skyrim from what was that little city called? Riven? It's eluding me. But from a poorer city or area that essentially they had to resort to this life. Like who chooses to be a rogue? It's thrust upon you. It's a necessary adaptation to the kind of substandard life you're leading. So if these roguish characters have a history of maybe they're impoverished, they haven't had access to great things before, what they might enjoy eating is expensive food. They want to feel like they're, comfortable, or maybe comfortable is not the right word, but that they have some level of prestige that they can afford luxury rather than old bread that's been left out. So the rogue is going to like expensive foods, whether this be something that is actually bought from a city or wherever, or if it's merely a meal that incorporates expensive ingredients from the player. So I like that a lot. That's a completely different metric than any of the other characters. So that gives, again, the player something else to balance. Swordsman is the last of the characters we had previously brainstormed. What would a swordsman like? From a martial arts perspective, they are the midpoint of knight, rogue, um, knight and rogue, I guess. They're the balance of strength and speed and grace, and all that sort of thing. But what I'm disliking is that if we just translate that directly to food, that just makes them enjoy everything generally, which isn't very exciting. Is there a different metric we can find other than creative meals, spoiled foods, or expensive for the swordsman? Hmm. Nothing is coming to mind. The only thing, well, this doesn't really fit a swordsman. I was considering another variable would be foods from a different location than the swordsman is used to. Food from a different country, different environment. That's the word I'm looking for. From a different environment. So like the variety of something that is not the hometown flavors. But I don't see a good through line that connects that to the swordsman. Is there something that would fit? I don't want to take hobbits. Obviously, we're not trying to lift Lord of the Rings directly into here. But I could see that food preference applying to something like a hobbit, where they're very sedentary, immobile people, and they live their whole lives on a certain cuisine in a certain area. We could make the argument that they would appreciate variety. But I can we think of a role other than the Hobbit that would fit that? Hmm. Maybe we're getting too focused on details. Maybe we're losing the forest for the trees, and we need to back up a step and try to approach this from a different angle. So far, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rolls, 10 counting the swordsman. Certainly want to get to 10. Let's see if we can find a different role to add in here. Knight. What? So the knight, as I think of the knight, it's a very heavy unit, large two-handed weapons. The barbarian is highly offensive focused, weaker defense, high damage. What we're missing is that perfect balance of the this is the term that's eluding me that I put swordsman in, but doesn't feel quite right. Of the Templar that has a sword and a shield, and is that solid, strong unit that is still offensively, capable. So it's a lighter unit than the knight, heavier than the barbarian, and meets that middle ground. Templar is not what I want. Swordsman isn't what I want either. This is tricky. All right, let's look at our roles again. Is there one that would naturally make sense for a fish loving, character? A fisherman or a sailor captain would fit here, but why would they ever be questing? I don't see that lining up here. Let's go up to the dragon for a little bit. I think thinking about dragons may help. Certainly sounds interesting. So we're back up to our races, and we have dragon. So something I thought about very briefly prior to this episode was from reading Aragon, incorporating dragons into this because it's awesome. And dragons would be extremely resource dependent. So they would need a huge amount of meat to survive. And like with the wizard and necromancer, they're a huge drain or hindrance on that collection and food prep stage of the game. but they'd have a much higher benefit to the questing aspect. So they'd add a huge boost to that. The question I had in mind regarding the dragons is, does it make sense to have different types of dragons, such as a water dragon that would need a huge amount of fish to grow versus we could say a forest dragon, or we could do the colors and say a blue dragon is a water dragon, a green or a red dragon is a forest dragon. Do we want to differentiate dragons or just leave them as they are? Part of me is tempted to just leave the dragon as is, just as a meta category, and say that they enjoy raw meat or fish. So just make them complete carnivores, huge resource drains, and let the player choose if they want to take the risk of investing heavily into the dragon in the hopes of letting it grow, get stronger, and positively influence the quest at the risk of draining all their other party members of most of the meat and fish. That's quite the decision to make. As I was saying that, I was thinking about that first thing I said of can't remember quite how I phrased it, but allowing the player to choose if they want to invest in the dragon or not. I've been thinking of sort of the round zero of the game as the player is given some of these characters randomly. Maybe that would probably be the case in that hard mode. In the creative mode, maybe the player can cherry pick and choose what race they want, what role they want for that race, and iterate that 5 times or so to get their party. That way they can, choose similar roles if they want to have a little bit of an easier time managing the party. But for the standard or the hard mode, I think that randomization is going to work well. So there's got to be some other fun roles, right? What am I overlooking here? One of my favorite stories that I read when I was let me sidetrack here. It's hard to tell how how sidetracked I want to get before returning to the roles. I think let's stay a little bit closer. I was going to do a long tangent about the Summoner series of characters that can summon and control different creatures. Let me just add Summoner in here just for the heck of it, and we'll see if we get to it. Okay, back to business. Let's add a shapeshifter. I think that'll be really fun. I'm thinking of the Sarah J. Maas Court of Thorns series with this one. I think that's the one I'm thinking of. Where one of the main characters is a shapeshifter. I guess it's not all that uncommon of a fantastic trope, but shapeshifter is somebody that can transform into various animals or creatures, mythical creatures or whatever, if they're powerful. And I think that'll be an easy one for us to identify food preferences because it's dependent on form. So in other words, whether that shapeshifter is a bear, a great deer, or whatever creature they are is going to inform what they actually want to eat. And the challenge of that obviously is that preparing the meal, you don't know what that character is going to need. So it becomes a relatively random, whether or not that you're going to hit what they like at any given time because when they come back from that quest, they could be any number of things, and you won't have time to adapt the meal. So you either need to try to be more general in your meal prep to hopefully hit something that they do like, or be ultra specific and make sure you're hitting all your other characters and just hope for the best that the shapeshifter happens to like one of the niche dishes that you prepared. Um, okay, shapeshifter, summoner is another one. I like some of these variants on the magic, magical role that we're filling. I think let's bring in assassin. I think that role is so unique, and we can probably find. Can we find something food wise to do with that? Um, obviously the challenge here is as we continue to build this out, it's going to get as we add more roles here, it's going to be harder to continue to find unique preferences, um, or to find other variables that we can slide with these characters' tastes. But that's why we do it. Try to be creative. Try to create a new gameplay loop that is different and distinct from anything a player has seen before. So I guess it's par for the course that it's going to take a little bit of thinking. So assassins, what would an assassin enjoy? At first glance, I would be tempted to do something similar to the rogue, where we said expensive food is preferable. Assassins. The second thought I had is that we could say they really like a certain style of food. So not the contents of it, but the styling of it, such as very spicy food. But I'm kind of that's I've lost my interest in that thread, I think. Dangerous food was kind of the origin of that idea of the spicy food sort of being a little bit dangerous. I think danger could have some worth to it. Because if assassins are sort of trained killers, I mean most of these roles are you know martial. They're all very, very dangerous. But the assassin's brand is that they are these trained, cold blooded killers. So, what if they enjoyed eating animals of a similar type? Like, like they wouldn't necessarily care for deer. Things like deer, bison, goats, whatever. Those are not predators. The assassins wouldn't care for those, but things like bears, um, we I guess we could have lions in this game, but um, you know, certain cats like cats is a little weird. We don't want to be eating cats. Let's stick with bears, with boars, with um, things like that. So I think I like that. I mean, it's a variation on what meat they prefer. Previously, we'd only said whether a role liked meat or didn't like it. Now we're specifying the type of meat, which is that assassins primarily like predators. Um, I'm trying to think. Do we want to add more to that? Predators, animals, or fish? Yeah, I think let's leave that there for now. Summoner is the next one. So a summoner would be somebody who's able to summon creatures, or I mean, we could populate that with whatever we want. It's not really that critical. It could be like, in Skyrim, you can summon different spirits of things. In that summoner series I mentioned, It was various mythological creatures. My sort of spark of an idea at first when I said summoner was that their food preference would be tied to what their summons enjoyed. But as I think of that in practice, it's seeming I don't see an obvious connection. So what would a summoner enjoy? If we're talking about summoners in the literal sense, I think it would be easiest to do like Skyrim, like Elden Ring, like any of those games where you summon a spirit. I think that's the summoner we're talking about here. So what would kind of echo the spirit realm? What food would echo the spirit realm? If we didn't have the necromancer, I would entertain something like, spoiled or older foods. Hmm. Maybe let's pass the summoner for now and see if we can come back. Now we're up to 3, 6, 9, 12 characters, which is very good. 12 counting the summoner. Any more that we can get? Hmm. So if we do some quick math, there are 4 roles, 12 characters, that's 48 variations. That's pretty good. I mean, that takes so many games to get the same party of 5, especially if we allow overlap. 2 human knights or whatever. If we allow duplication, that's massive amount of variability, which I really like. I think, oh yeah, let's take a pause on character roles. I think, like I said, 12 is really good. And I want to turn to envisioning this quest stat relationship. So this isn't something that I've obviously thought about before that much. But what I want to do is open the standard model of this game up to allow the player to have a hand in the quest, not selection, they already have that, but in the determination of like the quest's success level. So I want to bring more variables into how the quest success level is determined so that the player can make a more informed decision about the quest that they select and how likely they think they are to succeed. And the easiest way I can see to do that is to associate some numbers with it. So if we think of a quest, previously we were basing the quest success level off of 2 things. One being the quest level. So I think that's still probably worth having. So the quest level and then the party morale. So those 2 things were the only contributors to the success rate. What I think I want to do now, and well, let me just lay out some ideas. I don't know what we're going to end up doing. One would be we identify a few attributes and then we assign those to the quest as well. So we could say like health, attack, defense, strength, that sort of thing. And we total the party's stats in a similar manner. And it's a case where the player can look and see these are the stats of my party relative to that of the level. That's what's going to inform more of my understanding of the success level. The one thing I don't like about that is that it strips out a lot of the character nuance that we're trying to introduce. So back to that example of the orcish archer, right? We said an orcish knight to start would love meat, love raw meat, and they would have a huge amount of strength and less dexterity. The orcish archer would have less strength and more dexterity. If we go to that model of the quest success determiner where it's based off of total party stats, there's no functional difference between an orcish archer and maybe you know a human barbarian. Like maybe the stats end up being the same, where the strength and dexterity of the orcish archer is equivalent to the human knight or whatever. So what we did there is we stripped out the quest like significance of having that having one character versus another, and the only difference between them at that point is the food that they like. I don't want to do that. I want to keep some value assigned to each possibility of role and race, without just totaling them to numbers. So if we go back down to kind of our quest success calculator, we've got level, party morale, and like I said, I don't want to just total the party stats. I think what we could do in some ways to institute like a round-based combat. And I want to try to be really specific about how we brainstorm this, because the goal of this game is not for the player to do combat. That's beyond the scope of what we want. It's diluting the kind of the cook's role in this, and it's becoming a broader, shallower game where there's now two meta games going on: the food and the battling. So I don't want the player to be responsible for it. But I think what we could do is if we, on the back end, off screen, we change this quest to be rather than a roll the dice, you have a 70% chance of success, here it is. Rather than that, we behind the scenes institute a round based thing. So let's say the quest is to defeat a troll in a cave. We give the trolls certain stats. We say those in the quest details, or we hint at them in the quest details. And then off screen, our party battles the troll. And how this is different than merely totaling our party stats and letting the random chance of success be determined and then do the roll, is that I think it allows for role nuance. So for example, in our dwarven archer example, sure, the stats may be the same as the human knight, but functionally in battle, that dwarven archer is going to be different. It's going to be a ranged unit, and maybe different combat style. So when we do the round-based combat on the back end, round one, maybe that archer can get a shot off on the troll, so it's doing some damage, and then round two, the troll is up to the archer, and the archer gets a second shot off, and then they begin trading blows. So there's extra damage potential in the quest for the archer because it's round based rather than merely stat versus stat. It also that same idea applies to things like healer, wizard, summoner, necromancer. Any character that has a sophisticated combat style can affect combat-based system, or can affect round-based combat differently than if it's merely stat totaling. So I think round-based behind the scenes is what we want. Coupled with, the stats. Now, as I was kind of laying some of that out, I was having some thoughts about how we communicate stats, of the quest. So I think, let me bounce this idea around and let's see how it sounds. So I do like the idea of having a quest level. So saying that this is a level 1 quest, this is a level 6 quest, whatever. Give the player a relative level of this is how difficult it is. I'm feeling a little bit of hesitation with saying this quest, the target of this quest or whatever, as a health of this, an attack of this, a defense of this, is resistant to poison, is XYZ. I think we're getting too granular at that point, and it becomes a game or becomes a homework assignment for the player of, okay, let's get the calculator out. What's the differentials on all these stats? Like how are these going to influence our success rate? Is this a quest I want to take? I don't want that quest selection screen to become a 5-minute deliberation over percentages. I think that's going to strip the momentum and some of the fun out of the game. So what I'm considering, and I'm open to other ideas, but what I'm considering is I recently watched a video by James Hoffman, who is a coffee connoisseur, explaining the flavor profiles of different coffees and how those are communicated in like grocery stores specifically. So on the front of every coffee bag, according to this video, there's a handful of adjectives in 3 different criteria. So it may be like strong, dark, well, not dark, I guess that's more of the roast, but like nutty, sweet, sharp, chocolate, creamy. These are all like specific flavors descriptors that are used on almost any bag. So like any coffee bag you look at probably has one or two of these words: fruity, creamy, light, smooth, chocolate, or nutty. Those are like, if I'm remembering correctly, those are like 2 of the 3 kind of descriptors of coffee, specifically describing like the acidity versus bitterness and the not like roast level, but what's the other one? The mouthfeel, is that the appropriate descriptor? But anyway, when you look at a bag of coffee, there's essentially 3 adjectives describing 3 different properties of the coffee. And if you know what creamy correlates to, maybe that means it's more acidic rather than bitter or whatever. I didn't do my homework and study the video that closely. But if you know what those 3 adjectives correlate to, you know essentially what the coffee should taste like. So what I'm considering for our game here is that we institute a similar descriptor system where, let's say it's a troll, to use that example again in the cave. We could say, level 3 quest, and then below that, bulky, strong, and whatever. We can add another descriptor. But those descriptors would inform the player of relative, bulky, meaning this is a very high health opponent, like very tanky. And then strong, meaning it can also do a high amount of damage maybe. There could be descriptors for like magic, if this is a magically oriented opponent. If it is slippery, like a assassin type whatever. And we can fill out 5 or 6 of these variables for each quest that we create a few adjectives for each one, and then below each quest the player can just quickly read the flavor of the quest, and then generally they'll know, how does my team match up against against that type of an opponent. I think I like that. Round base behind the scenes. So we would add, I'm going to make this a note here, add descriptors for the plot, for the quest variables. And I want to build these out, I think. So health of opponent, number of opponents would be another one. Let's say like relative damage. Damage, magical abilities would be another one. So we have health, number of opponents, damage, magical abilities. What will be another one, like geographical variables. So it, like, if is this in a cave that is very difficult to traverse, or is do they have to take a boat out to get to this? Like, what geographical factors are at play with this quest that could hinder or help the party? What else do we want in there? We don't want probably 20 variables here, but maybe health, number, damage, magic in the geography are enough of a start. And I'll just add another one here for like other or just miscellaneous, whatever. Which, by the way, is a tricky word to spell a lot of the times. All right. So I'm seeing enough now, I think, where that round or the quest selection aspect is pretty accessible, because it doesn't become a numbers game. It becomes a strengths and weaknesses game. And then that's what you compare against how badly you need what each environment can offer you. I think that's a more interesting question for our players to encounter. Good deal. So that's quest success determiners. I feel like there was something else maybe I wanted to add in there. Maybe not. Lots of thoughts. Okay, let's take a look at what we filled out today and see if anything else comes to mind. I really like the ground we covered today. So for our races, we created a human, an elf, a dwarf, an orc, and a dragon. Each of those has a different base preference for food, whether that be balanced, light, sort of mushroomy and rooty, or raw meat. And then we created a group, many subgroups of the roles. So any of the races, except for the dragon, unfortunately, can be one of these roles. And then the role that the race is further tailors the food preferences. Sometimes it will amplify the base preferences of the race. Sometimes it will sort of cancel out and create a little bit more of a balanced unit. Where was I? Where are we? Create a bit more of a balanced unit, which would be weaker in combat, generally speaking, but easier to maintain and a little bit easier on the resource toll. We created 12 characters in total, which I'm excited about because they are very different in terms of food quantities, food preferences, and then some of the other variables we threw in there, such as the wizard enjoying creative meals, the necromancer enjoying spoiled foods, rogue liking expensive things, and shapeshifter just depending on whatever form they're currently in, so a varying preference. And then the assassin enjoying predators. The summoner is one I will return to and kind of fill in a little bit later. And then we detailed a little bit more about how the role of the characters influences the quest success. So that being specifically that quests will have different sort of strengths described by some of these, these little descriptors, similar to our coffee setup that I mentioned earlier, and that a different party will be suited differently for one quest rather than another. So I think that's enough variables for a player to juggle. We, I think, are in a great place to kind of close the loop on the the gameplay ideation of this. The only sort of unexplored front I can see would be if we want to add some nuance to the roles as it relates to combat. So in other words, if we want to give each role a different like in combat effect, it's not actually that critical because the whole round based combat is happening off screen. So if I do add something like that to the, for example, the rogue has on any one turn it has a 10% chance to poison the opponent, which would do a certain amount of damage every turn thereafter. If we want to add like a special effect for each role in combat, we could. But like I said, it's happening off screen. It isn't massively critical, and I don't think it's worth our focus today to try to lay that out. So that being said, I think we've got a great handle on the gameplay. The next step would be for me to fill in a couple of these details on my own, and then turn some attention to the round 3 dinner stage, where we're going to have that little storytelling. The stories that the characters tell are going to inform some in-game world aspects. So this is going to be economy related. In this given game, this particular food is extra valuable to this culture. That's some of the information that's going to be relayed in the storytelling, while also just being a relaxing break from the game. And leaning more into our theme of casual, relaxed, fun game. So I would suspect in a future episode we'd build out a story or two that would go in there, and then the subsequent stories I'll build out on my own. Like I said in the previous episode, I'm looking forward to getting this thrown up on the site. I'm in the early stages of building a website where all of this content is going to be hosted, and we can get a lovely game developer to turn an eye towards this and get developing, because this is a fun game to ideate, to think about, but if I can say so, I think it would be a very fun game to play. And I would certainly like to play it, which is where our developers come in. So I think that's a great stopping point for us today, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next page.